Hi, students. It's so good to be with you all again. I am excited, as always, to share with you some more ideas and concepts in the area of critical race studies, specifically critical race theory. We'll start off with just recapping what we've talked about and then moving on to some new ideas. I hope you don't mind my brief recaps at the beginning of each video. I hope that they help you see how all of these ideas connect with one another. And then just also give you a good review because, of course, we have the midterm coming up in a few days. If the review is not helpful for you or too repetitive or boring, feel free to fast forward right on through. So we will get started here with our PowerPoint. Again, we're talking about central tenets of critical race theory, and we talked about how race was a social construction. It is a biological myth. There's nothing genetic about race. There's nothing biological about race. It is a biological myth that has evolved into a sociological fact that can, in fact, have life and death consequences. Race is a social construction. It is a social construction. It's a concept or idea that's based on collective views within society, that's maintained within a society through cultural or social practice. It's not something that occurs naturally. But again, race can have life and death consequences. Watch that video, The Myth of Race Debunked in 3 Minutes. It's super helpful and gives a really concise view of the ideas we're talking about. Racism is ordinary. It's not aberrational. It's not anything exceptional. It's ordinary. We know how oppressive it can be. And so that tends to make us talk about racism in a very sort of like overtly negative way. And although its consequences can be overtly negative, racism is nothing out of the ordinary. That doesn't mean that it's good, but it's simply nothing out of the ordinary. That is what critical race theorists hold, that it is something that is literally embedded into the fabric of our society. It is a historical tool that is used to organize society at all levels and all the time. So this is the racism that we recognize: Confederate flags, KKK hoods, people using racial slurs, things like that. But that is not really the racism that we are concerned with. We are concerned with the ordinary structural and institutional racism, the kind that's literally woven into the fabric of our society, so much that it is so ordinary that we are all racists, not because we are bad people, but because we are participants, both willing and unwilling, in the system that divides us into hierarchies, that ranks us into hierarchies by this idea called race. And so we are so concerned with the racism that we do not see. And we're also concerned with acknowledging our own privileges and racist attitudes, which is included but not limited to the microaggressions that are carried out on a daily basis, those everyday verbal and nonverbal and environmental slights, those things that might be perceived as small, that communicate a hostile message to a targeted person in a marginalized group. The primary example is a white woman clutching her purse in the elevator when she sees a Black man. We would call that a microaggression. She did not overtly attack him. She did not call him a slur. She did not do anything to him. This is microaggressive because it is ever so slight. It is ever so normal that we don't even notice sometimes that we're doing it. That's what makes it a microaggression. Asking an Asian person whether or not they can see as much because of the shape or size of their eyes, a microaggression, something that you might view harmless as a harmless question, but it is an ignorant assumption that there is something biological, genetic, deficient about race is a microaggression. And then as we move from talking about microaggressions, because individuals are exposed to and engage in microaggressions in different ways, these oppressive actions are there to reinforce the racial hierarchies and the power relations of our society. So critical race theory realizes that there are many different ways that we can be subjugated, many different ways that we can be held down or marginalized. It's not just because of our race. there are many other ways, such as our gender, such as our sexual orientation, such as our religion, such as our level of ability or our level of disability. That's what intersectionality talks about. It recognizes that we aren't just one singular, uncomplicated identity. I am not just Black. I am not just a woman. I am not one single uncomplicated identity that's just based on my race or just based on my gender. I have multiple identities. You have multiple identities that intersect with class, sex, sexual orientation, political orientation, disability, and personal history that form your complex personal identity. And then there is an illustration of intersectionality, how all of these many identities connect with one another to form the whole of our identity, but also to allow us or put us in a position in a racist society or a gender biased society, or a society that divides based on religion, things that our society does based on nationality, based on language, based on citizenship status. All those things connect with one another and impact the access that we have to achievement, the access that we have to opportunity, and the way that we are treated. That's intersectionality. And then we talk about institutional and structural racism. And of course, I went too far here, so I'm just going to go back around. Pardon me. Y'all know I always do that. Institutional and structural racism. And I hope you guys are still following me on this PowerPoint. Let me just unshare and reshare just to make sure. I get so nervous about you guys not getting everything, even though you've seen this slide on intersectionality already, and we were on institutional and structural racism. So we act out these microaggressions, not just in interpersonal exchanges, but also in collective manners as well. All of these attitudes, all of these actions are a natural consequence of our history. And if our actions are a natural consequence of our history, it also follows that our institutions, our structures, our laws, our customs, our practices, all of those things are also a consequence of our history. As a matter of fact, our very constitutional document, our very founding document, is a racist document. It's a document that implicitly acknowledges that there are some people who will be in an in group and in a have group and in a group that is able to be free and able to be liberated and able to maneuver throughout society. And there is another group that will be marginalized, that will be subjugated, that will be held down and used to benefit that other group. That's institutional or structural racism. It's the way that our laws, our customs and practices systematically reflect and reproduce racial inequalities in society. The way that these things are woven and embedded into our structure. And it's this idea, an excellent, again, chief example, the number of Black men in prison and jails, the number of Hispanic men in prison and in jails compared to the number of white men in prisons and in jails, when white people make up far more of the population than Black people, but Black people make up numerous times the percentage of the population of prison and jail, although Black men do not statistically commit more crime. However, Black men find themselves in jails and prisons more often because the laws and the structures are written in such a way that Black men are going to be more prone to going to jail. The process of policing and the way in which Black neighborhoods are policed, the level of police presence, all of the things, the fact that once you have a criminal record, you are more likely to be charged with another crime. All of those things taken together contribute, those are structural inequalities and institutional inequalities that contribute to reproducing these racist outcomes. And we talk about differential racialization, the way that the dominant society racializes people, the way that the various and very strategic way that we actually structure our government and our institutions, wherein the dominant group gets to redefine whenever it wants to who does and does not fit into a racial group. They do the racializing, they decide, just like over time in various places, the definition of who's white, who's Black has changed over time. And I know that's especially relevant to you Latinos, especially in light of the case law that we've studied. And then we talked about, because of that, whiteness is property. Whiteness is not just an identity, although it can be. It's not just a status, although it can be. Sometimes it is literally property. Being able to fit in the definition of whiteness gives you the legal entitlements that arise from that status. So it can give you an identity, a status, and property that allows you access to certain things that other people simply do not have. And because of that, because white privilege is a thing, and because it is real, and because whiteness is property and allows you and affords you opportunities that other groups do not have, critical race theorists believe that the unique, authentic voice of a member of a marginalized group, the unique, authentic voice of a member of an oppressed group, the unique, authentic voice of a Black person, of a Hispanic person, of a woman, of a disabled person, that unique and authentic voice is the voice that critical race theorists believe should be privileged. Although many writers and thinkers of all groups are able to research and learn and also speak with authority on certain issues, critical race theorists believe that minority writers and thinkers are generally in a better position than white writers and thinkers to speak about race and racism because they experience it directly. And so because of that, we cannot adopt an ideology of colorblindness, because that ideology of colorblindness and that empathetic fallacy that says that all we have to do is treat people well without regard to race or culture, this meritocracy that says that, and that you see that root word merit, to that and then ocracy, you see that in like democracy and a lot of other governmental words that talk about how things are arranged. It's a system. The ocracy, when you see that, it's talking about a system. Meritocracy, the system of merit, that says that if you just work hard enough, you can achieve, but dismisses the differentiated social experiences that come with race. That's what happens when we're colorblind, because we say this person is working hard, but this person is not doing well. It must mean that they need to work harder, when really there are social experiences associated with race that can keep a person from, and do keep people from, advancing. So that moves us on to, what are those things? What are those things that keep us from advancing even when we work hard? That's those structural inequalities. We talked about it when we talked about Black and Hispanic men in the prison population. The structural inequalities, the embedded bias that is woven throughout the very fabric of our government institutions and organizations, that relate this again to the very similar idea of institutional and structural racism. That's these structural inequalities. They are woven into the very fabric of our government, institutions, organizations, and social structures. These are biases that provide advantages for some people at the expense of other people who are disadvantaged, who are marginalized. These inequalities exist everywhere. In the area of housing, the geographic location of housing, certain places, in the area of healthcare and access to healthcare, in the area of education and other opportunities. And they're embedded into the culture of our country due to slavery, due to Jim Crow, and other subsequent suppression of marginalized people. All the things that happened and continue to happen that were passed down from slavery, those things continue to marginalize people today. Those structural inequalities are both maintained and encouraged through structured institutions. One of those examples is the school system. Think about the geographic location of schools. If schools are in an area where the property taxes are high, where there are predominantly white populations, those schools tend to be better funded. There tends to be a better education. Teachers tend to want to teach there. Those are structural inequalities. Nobody per se did anything wrong. Nobody did anything that we would consider overtly racist before we took our critical race theory class and we realized that racism was ordinary and everywhere. But those things are embedded into the structure of society. Because of that, um, because of that, the geographic location of schools is a structural inequality within the education system. Think about standardized testing, things that have questions on there that are culturally biased, that certain groups, think about the writers of standardized tests, those tests reference ideas that certain people of color are unfamiliar with. Doesn't mean that they are inferior in understanding and in intellect. However, if there is a point of reference that they don't understand because of race or culture, because of where and how they're situated in society, that represents a structural inequality, because we know that in every school there is going to be standardized testing. There are so many more examples, but those are just a few unique to the education system, which we're all currently participating in. And then there's the idea of racial idealism versus racial realism. When we talk about structural inequalities, that's sort of the domain of racial realism, structural inequalities. In contrast, racial idealism is about attitudes. We talked about colorblindness, and we've mentioned the empathetic fallacy that says if you're just good to people, if everyone just treats everyone else right, then that's going to help us get rid of racism. That's idealism. It holds that race and discrimination come from attitudes. It's born out of attitudes and social formations, stereotypes, categories, symbols. So yes, according to idealists, we can get rid of racism if we just change these narratives, get the racist books out, get the racist symbols out, get the racist narratives that say that Black people are lazy, that say that, certain groups of people are this way, to say that women are emotional, too emotional, things like that. Get rid of those ideas, and then the ideas that promote or reinforce racism, and then we'll be fine. In contrast, realism says that racism is a system. It's systemic, and it's used to allocate wealth. It's used to allocate privilege. It's used to allocate status. That's that argument that racism is the father of race and not the other way around, that it has little to do with attitudes. Even though, yeah, the racist words, stereotypes, categories, symbols, those things matter. But they matter insofar as they accommodate the interests of the majority. They reassure them. The majority, racial realists say, are concerned with the economic structures, money. That's material determinism. They are concerned with money. They are concerned with economic structures. They are concerned with capitalism. They are concerned with power. They're concerned with imperialism, colonialism, growth, economic growth, acquisition of property, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They're interested in those things. And those are the foundations for structural racism. Those are the chief motivating factors. That's what racial realists say when it comes to white and elite racism. And that the fact that idealists say that racism is a function of symbols, of language, and of psychology, they say that those things matter, but those things only exist to reassure and vindicate, make them feel okay, give the majority a justification, give the dominant group a justification for their subjugation, for their mistreatment, for their oppression, for their marginalization of certain groups. It allows them to feel okay about what they've done. But the motivating factor wasn't the racist attitude originally. It's not enough. The motivating factor was the money. It was the material gain. It was the capitalistic economic gain. While realists view domestic structural racism as a manifestation of the patterns of the US empire and capitalism, idealists say it's just a psychological deficiency that prevents non-whites from joining the imperialist and capitalist institutions. It's just psychological. We just need to rid ourselves of it psychologically. But Delgado specifically argues in your text that for racial realists, the material factors such as profits, access to the labor market are more decisive. That's what decides who gets to participate in the system. That's what decides. And these stereotypes, these racist attitudes, all those things do It served to justify this hierarchy and this system of racism so that it can perpetuate, so that it can continue, and so that people can feel okay about using it. Which brings us to the idea that has been mentioned over and over and over: material determinism, interest convergence. We have now established that the foundation of racism is capitalistic gain. It's money, it's profit, it's access to power, it's access to the labor markets. That is what we mean by material determinism and interest convergence. Specifically, this idea of interest convergence is worded very well to express this idea that states that the majority group only tolerates advancements in racial justice only when it suits its interest to do so, only when its interests converge with the interests of the minority. So when material factors such as money, imperialism, capitalism, economic gain, power, global hegemony, that means global leadership, global power, global control, when those factors are involved, the dominant group may very well yield, may very well tolerate temporary, that's very important, temporary racial advancements when it suits them. This is a cost-benefit analysis that they do. It is okay to tolerate some racial advancement. It may shake things up just a little bit. However, if it will provide the majority group with more global leadership, with more money, with more capitalism, with greater power, with greater economic gain, with greater imperial access in the world, a better standing in the world, then they will tolerate racial advancements. They weigh the costs and the benefits. And if the benefits to the dominant group outweigh the costs, then they will tolerate temporary racial advancements. This is one of Bell's chief arguments regarding the failure of Brown versus Board of Education. Derek Bell argues that the so-called advancement and the on paper, remember early on we talked about de facto versus de jure meaning by law, but de facto meaning what's actually happening in society. This is one of Bell's chief arguments regarding the failure of Brown versus Board of Education. Derek Bell says that advancement, that what seemed like progress, one, wasn't really progress at all because it didn't change anything in society. Most importantly, it wasn't actually progress at all. But two, any progress that was had was only temporary. All the court did was follow up and say, local governments, you do that, and do it with all deliberate speed, but never even really instituted any real orders about how school desegregation was supposed to be. And then it was followed up by quotas, but equality was never had. Equality in education never resulted from Brown versus Board of Education. All it was a temporary advancement because the interests of people of color, the interest specifically of Black people, and the interest of the majority, the dominant majority, and their desire for global respect, for economic gain, for all the things that they thought that they were going to get out of the Brown versus Board decision so that they could look better on an international front. All of those things that they thought they could gain from the Brown decision were only temporary advancements due to material determinism and due to the fact that their interests converged, overlapped with the interests of people of color, and not because of any mindset shift, certainly not, and not because there was any intention of maintaining and continuing the progress that was supposedly had under Brown versus Board. So again, if this is confusing, if you have any questions, please, please, please let me know. As you're studying for the midterm, I'm happy to help. Holler at me on Blackboard or shoot me an email. Happy studying, and I'll be back with you soon.